All right, Becca, are you ready? Oh, you're on mute.
Thought I was
Awesome.
ready, not ready, but ready
Yes,
now.
totally ready. No,
Hello.
we're there. Hey, it's good to see you. I really
Good to
enjoyed our
see
conversation as we
you.
started to prep out this session here. And I want to get right into it. Everybody, if you don't know who Beca Alexander is, she's an accomplished entrepreneur whose experience in the field behind the editor's desk at fashionindie.com helped her to launch a company called Socialite in 2012. This is a company has grown substantially in size, working both with influencers and a kind of a co-partnered company to work with brands in the sense of really making influencer marketing powerful and impactful. And so with that said, I'd love to just hear from you, your thoughts on this industry. We heard a little bit from Grin on the tool of theirs, and
Yeah,
we'll talk about tools in a second before spoiling
definitely.
it.
My
But
favorite subject.
yeah, like, well, I think is as a historian perhaps, and I'd love to just hear. Influencer marketing wasn't even a thing a few years ago. You've been on the pulse of it for so long. How have you seen it like grow and change? What did it look like in the past and all that?
Yeah, I mean that's such a heavy question. I mean, there's been so many changes, and without obviously talking about all of the sort of more granular level changes, taking it up to like the macro level. I mean, 10-ish years ago when I first started, before it was actually even a company, I was helping negotiate, $20 to $50 deals for my girlfriends who were, known as bloggers
Wow.
at the time. This was right when blogging had just started as even a way for individual people to create content and right reach a certain audience. And then of course, with the industry, sort of with the growth of the industry, with more money being put into sort of the blogging space, or even the kind of newer media space, right? I would call it. The sort of rise of what is now called influencer marketing really began. I would say that was probably 6, 7 years ago. And it
Yeah.
really took off with the social platforms. I mean, obviously, there were a lot of bloggers. Everyone had a blog. Each blog was about what they did that day and what they wore and like products they recommended. And then with social media, it really took off in the sense that the barrier to entry was so much lower than basically building your own website, even if like the WordPresses of the world made it really easy and simple. But right, anyone could basically download the app, start creating content, post themselves, post a little caption, and grow an audience. And as brands started recognizing the space as something that, speaks to newer audiences and really engages audiences in a way, it became its own industry. And now, everyone and their mother is an influencer. On top of that, everyone and their mother touches influencer marketing in some way, right? From brands directly to platforms and tools and technologies to agencies that have had to kind of offer these capabilities to their clients, and then of course, sort of the management side of things where influencers are now known as talents, who are launching their own product lines and building their own businesses, becoming entrepreneurs. That's kind of the like macro level of where we are today.
Yeah, okay. We've glossed over this a lot. I want to go
Yeah.
back to you mentioned like everyone being an influencer, or everyone having the ability to. In
Yep.
the like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, as this started to take off, did you see that it was only the large influencers that were actually making money? Was it
Yes.
these, you mentioned $20 and $50 deals, so the small micro bloggers, and obviously we could talk about the transition from blogging to YouTube to
Mhm.
other channels and all that, but just thinking about like was it actually everybody and their mother trying to be an influencer and just being scrappy and seeing what they could get money wise for posting? Or do you feel like the organization started with like the Michael Jordans and Kim Kardashians up there at the top?
So yeah, I mean, of course, if we sort of look at how where the roots of the industry started, you can kind of date it back to like celebrity endorsements, right?
Yeah.
Back to I remember doing a history presentation on this for a recent client, and I went all the way back to even like Tony the Tiger, right? Who was an influencer and the first of sort of its kind, right? Like a character developed specifically to be the face of a brand and create a lifestyle.
Yeah.
That led to, celebrity and sort of Hollywood endorsements, which then led to kind of where we are with influencers today. But, outside of that, I think most of the bloggers that I had the experience, with, or that I launched the agency with, were sort of young guys and girls who had full-time jobs, who needed a creative outlet, who, had their own diary that they decided to basically make public and take photos of themselves. And that sort of grew, that like democratization of content and that ability to like relate to someone who's just like you. There's sort of that, like, if you look at media brands, more traditional media brands, right? Like magazines, there was always that disconnect between a magazine and the beautiful people in the magazine to sort of the audience. And I think blogging and influencing and sort of this new media that developed kind of bridged the gap there, right? It allowed for people to really relate to these individuals, but also have a direct line of communication with them. Because
how did this affect content? So we because media is pristine, you have photo shoots, and now you're putting it in the hands of like semi-professionals and so forth. Do you think that changed? Because now where we are today is like, you need we had Evan talking about TikTok as our opening keynote today, and he's like, whatever you do, don't make it look professional. So now,
right.
So we can think of, did the content slowly go like less and less professional?
Well, so it's gone like this, actually, in my opinion. So obviously, yes, if you look at glossy magazines or advertisements, historically editorials, they were up here in terms of the highest quality, like production value, right? When bloggers first started, I mean, they were shooting, with their like DSLR, basically, whatever camera they had at home, maybe not even a DSLR. And they were posting these photos. And as blogging became a bigger industry before Instagram, before sort of the more visual social platforms, bloggers that started gaining recognition, who started making a little bit of money, realized that they actually needed to invest in the content and make the content higher quality, because that's what people wanted. They wanted
they were
sort of
pushed to the limit to go back up to magazine style quality.
Correct. And of course, outside of people who, who were posting like the what I wore content, what I wore, what I did, what products I use, there was sort of also these like photography blogs, right? People who just had like a sort of desire to create images, right? And then you can kind of also talk about like the Tumblrs of the world and how that led to, platforms that were just image sort of heavy, right? Versus the like, today I went to the market and I bought apples and I wore this really pretty dress and I'm very excited to go to the movies tonight, right? Like that's what content used to be like on the blogs. And then of course
you said what I wore, what I did, what products I used.
I mean, that's basically how it started, right?
That was the start of influencer marketing.
Exactly. And then Instagram launched, and it launched with a way for everyday people to be able to share instant moments, right? And those moments were very low quality because they were meant to be taken with your phone, right? And then it sort of went up again, where the people that were gaining followers were curating their feeds in a much more editorialized way with higher quality content. And then you saw this big rise of sort of influencers who are creating these like very professional, high quality editorial images, which then gave rise to the travel influencers, right? Because the travel influencers were like, not only can I do what you did, I'm going to up you by standing on top of a mountain.
Yeah.
Right. And there's going to be a sunset behind me and I'm going to capture some birds. So like that, you know what I mean? So that was the cliff there. And then a couple years ago, what we really saw was sort of, and I think this happened with some of the other social platforms that launch, and just there being too much content and people really feeling like they've lost touch and that connection to influencers. Right. Like there was,
they were
was
too
just
pristine.
like,
so
they were too pristine. Exactly. They were basically, well, now you're just Vogue. So like now I have the same problem I had 20 years ago where I don't relate to you anymore. I can't travel to the top of the mountain. I can't stay at these 5-star hotels. I can't wear that gown. I can't live this life. And therefore I'm not interested. And the younger generation, right, like the Gen Zers of the world are just like, I don't give a shit about any of that stuff. I'm just trying to show you that I'm like goofy and fun and I have a personality. And then that group of individuals started gaining attention. And then obviously the rise of TikTok and, some of the content that was doing really well on YouTube and, stories and, Snapchat probably really started this trend. It's sort of that quicker, like personality focused, short format, like in the moment content became king again. So we again saw this sort of like if you didn't post content that felt like you just shot it, it wasn't on your camera, you didn't pay someone to stand there, it wasn't done with like a tripod and a clicker, and now all we see is basically what we call photo dumps, which is, carousels of photos, like 5, 6 or more photos of just like random shit that 5 years ago, if you posted that, it was considered filler content and you were going to get canceled. Like if you posted an acai bowl, you were like, all right, that was so like, 2005, what are you doing? So that's kind of, I got my year wrong there, but
but you've seen the ebbs and flows of this. I mean, it has to be it's simultaneously great that you're able to see the trends and see the changes in the market, but it has to be a little bit frustrating because you might have found something that worked 5 years ago for the merchant, and then over time you're like, this is a system we've put in place, or for the influencer and all that stuff, and then it's like, okay, the system is breaking, we have to continuously change what we're doing, and you have to manage all of this. So I think there's
and I think
there.
Honestly, the frustration comes, well, part of that is what's exciting, right? It's never the same day, it's never the same year. There's always a new challenge, there's always a new platform, there's always a new trend. And keeping up with them is actually what keeps you really engaged in the industry and what keeps our team excited about, like, where are the opportunities? Where is this going? Where is this moving? How do we get in front of it? How do we think bigger, right? That's like what I'm here for. But on the flip side, the frustrating part, I think, is not being able to know or predict or understand what will be successful. So for example, on the talent side of our business, 5 years ago, if, an influencer knocked on our door and was like, all right, I have 100,000 followers, how do I get to 500,000? We'd be like, okay, one of this, go, right? Today, people are coming to us and saying, I'm doing everything that I think Instagram wants me to do, but I'm losing followers, I'm losing engagement, I can't keep my story views up, my impressions and reach are below 10%. And we honestly, a lot of times don't know what to do, because you'll see 2 pieces of content that you think are similar that should perform equally, and they just don't. Right? So it's really difficult to be able to, on the brand side, strategize a campaign that's going to hit certain benchmarks without having to pay for the media in order to ensure that you actually hit those benchmarks, because content could one day just not perform the way you anticipated to, and now you're below what you sort of promised.
I see. So maybe from a brand side, this means that we should, when working with an influencer, plan on testing like 20 different tactics, strategies, content types, or something like that, rather than like putting the eggs into one post that we think is going to do well. We test multiple, and then maybe there's a double down strategy that comes with that.
Exactly. So what we typically do, if it's a first time working with a brand, or we're putting together a longer term strategy, it really is trial and error. Like, for example, right now, so many of our clients that have been working with us for years are coming to us, and have been for the past year, saying, what do we do on TikTok? What's our strategy? What are we going to do? And it's really hit or miss, right? Like, you can either go to TikTok directly and you can buy a $300,000 media, challenge, right? At which point they guarantee a certain amount of impressions, or you can hand select your own talent, sort of negotiate with them or through their marketplace. And then you hope that the content performs. And sometimes it does. And sometimes it goes viral and you're like, wow, that was amazing. And sometimes you're like, it actually didn't perform the way I wanted it to. Same with Instagram, right? Same with YouTube at the end of the day. So what we do is there's a lot of trial and error, and we try to, spread the money across a lot of different talent, a lot of different platforms, to really understand how do certain brands and clients and categories, at certain price points, really perform with different audiences, with different, content types, in order to try to kind of reverse engineer the strategy, where first you understand, okay, if this is the product or the brand, this is the price point, and this is the audience they're looking to reach, where is that audience? What platform are they on, and what type of content are they engaged in? And if, we can pinpoint what that is, which a lot of times we can, who are then the influencers that we need to cast, and secure, that can create that type of content. And that's the best way we can sort of ensure that we're succeeding. And if that doesn't work, then we essentially add some media dollars to that content to basically ensure that it reaches, more of that audience that we might have not reached organically.
I got you. This is interesting, and I think you're hinting at in order to figure out what you're talking about, in order to create this strategy, there needs to be a layer of data here that, like,
Correct.
analyzing influencers, followers,
Correct.
and all of that stuff. So who owns the data in these situations? And tell me about this great data fight that influencers are sometimes having with platforms.
Yeah, so funny enough, just a little bit of context, 5, 6 years ago, when everything was sort of about bloggers, it was really easy because you just got a screenshot from their Google Analytics and you could easily identify, how many people were reading the blog, how often were they reading it, who were they, et cetera. And then there came a point where certain bloggers were photoshopping that. So,
Ooh,
yeah,
liars.
they would send you a
That's
screenshot and you'd be like, I don't know, something's off about this, right? Then came Instagram. And as people grew on Instagram, brands were like, oh, they have 100,000 followers? Great. And brands just wanted to work with people who had the highest followers.
Thus,
right?
the rise of the 10,000 followers for $5 fake follower world became a thing.
Exactly. Because, with Google Analytics, there came a point where there was no way to access that data as an agency or as a brand. The influencer owned it, right?
Mhm.
So you had to get a screenshot from the influencer. And of course, there was only a handful of times where it was like, that's not the case.
Yeah.
But it felt like this situation where you couldn't really own the data, right? With Instagram, it was right there. You could see exactly how many followers they had. And right. And then Instagram fucked that all up by, redoing their algorithm and allowing for influencers to have access to certain data on their back end as it relates to how many people their content was actually reaching, right? So engagement was developed, right? During that time, that metric of engagement, which doesn't really exist in media, right? You have reach and impressions and you have CPMs and you have all of these other sort of more traditional avenues of looking at performance, but engagement isn't really one of them, right? So then everyone figured out that, okay, if someone has 100,000 followers, it doesn't mean those 100,000 followers are looking at the content. So who are they actually?
One sale or 1,000 sales. It's still not clear.
Exactly. It's very unclear. So then you had a similar issue where the influencers still owned that data and they could find ways to manipulate it, or they could buy followers, or engagement or comments. Remember they were you could literally buy,
bots?
Comment bots. And at some point you were like, oh, all
Nice
of their
post,
comments
winky
are,
face.
a bunch of emojis or just thumbs up or I like your dress. And it was well, it's actually jeans, but great, that kind of stuff. So
those things were the worst.
That really, changed the game for us as well. So then that gave the rise to a lot of these sort of technology tools and platforms that connected directly into, Instagram and Facebook and et cetera, and gave you access to some of this data, including,
it couldn't be faked at this point.
It couldn't be faked except for, in my personal belief today, there is still no one who can tell you how much of an influencer's audience is fake. People have developed certain, algorithms and formulas and et cetera, and they can make certain assumptions, but no one can truly say this person bought X amount of followers.
I got you. I feel like I've seen some tools that do that, right? They just literally show a bar and 5% fake or whatever, which is
right.
5% is probably normal. It just kind of happens because those bots follow your
exactly. And there's definitely a way to, identify, what a lot of people claim as fake is inactive. So, looking at profiles where no one posts on that profile. Right. And there's a lot of tools out there that are okay, well, the way we tell this 5% is, we look at all of their followers and we see who has a profile photo, who has a name, how much content have they posted, how are they engaging with other, and then they make certain assumptions.
Yeah.
Right. But at the end of the day, that's relatively difficult. So
also, if their name is John Smith 8472851,
yeah, probably, exactly. And if there's 4 of them, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of these things that happen, which is why the sort of metric of followers has completely died off in our industry. Nobody brand will come to us today and be like, all right, we need someone with 1 million followers. They'll come to us and say, we need someone, who's reaching X amount of people, who has a 3% and above engagement, who's speaking to this audience, who has story views, above 30%. So like
Nice.
it's really come down to a really granular, sort of level of data that's important to the brands. And they will only work with influencers who hit those specific benchmarks.
And how are influencers maybe limited in their use of data? So they're trying to get platform data or figure out who their demographics are, so that they can show brands. Is there more that the platforms like Facebook we had on earlier could do to help influencers, present their data or whatever it is?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so one of the biggest disconnects that we find in the industry is, the influencers, for example, on Instagram, they have insights, right? They can look and see who they're reaching, and they basically get, 4 or 5 data points, right? They can see the age of their audience, views and impressions and reach on their content, right? They can see their story views, they can see swipe ups on stories, and they can see certain demographic data. Certain demographic data on their audience, right? Like age and location is really the biggest breakdown.
Like country,
country and city.
Okay. So we're getting fairly granular.
So, but that's it. That's all you get. You have no other sort of behavioral, or psychographic information. And the biggest disconnect is what you get as an influencer directly from Instagram, right? Facebook, Instagram, is what we call first party data. So that exists. Then there's this sort of set of third-party data that companies like Demographics Pro, for example, provide. And some of that data is, purchased directly from Facebook, and some of it is found through other sort of sources and aggregated and, et cetera. Okay. And that data is then sold to brands or blended with the first-party data and then provided to brands by platforms.
Okay, so, I see.
Right. So, and that's the big difference is, for example, a luxury brand looking to work with an influencer has no way of knowing, does that influencer's audience actually buy luxury items?
Yeah. Do they have $150,000 average income, or is it $40,000 average income?
Right. And that data technically doesn't exist. So like no one can really tell you if an influencer reaches, a portion of their audience makes above $150,000, because the way that data is grabbed, and my understanding, you actually correct me if I'm wrong, is basically Facebook and LinkedIn make certain assumptions based on the information that you as an individual person tell them as a platform, including where you went to school, where you live, what your job title is, where you work, is it a big company, a small company, et cetera. And they make certain predictions and assumptions on approximately the value of, your household. And then that third party data is sold, through Demographics Pro to all of these other providers.
Yeah, so there is one other layer there, because they, Facebook, LinkedIn, they partner with Experian or other large data companies. And those companies are pulling, so especially when it comes to financial and like household demographics, they're pulling data from like your loan application and your credit report, and things that you wish were never tied to you, but like when you run those things, there's some sort of opt-in or checkbox or something that gives them more access. So that one helps, but I don't think that data is actually then being shared with the influencer. So I think that's where the information stops at Facebook.
Exactly. So that's my point. So it's not shared with the influencer, but certain, platforms and tools, have that data. Or as an agency, like for example, Socially can go directly to a Demographics Pro or any of these other data providers and buy that data. And then we can say, okay, we manage, these 180,000 people, 180 people who reach, X amount of people. What portion of their audience, or which of these influencers have the most like luxury audience? And we can get that data, but how real is that data? Can I take that to Mercedes and say, these are the influencers whose majority, of the audience is reaching people who have a household income of above $150,000 confidently? No.
Well, one thing that I have to imagine you're doing with your influencers now is seeing their performance with a luxury brand or another brand and starting to kind of categorize that and say, okay, and
Correct.
I'm sure their follower counts change all the time, but so it's like at this stage, at this follower level, we were able to generate XYZ like engagement and sales for this luxury brand.
Correct. So
Mhm.
basically, as an agency, what our best option is to make sure that, the influencers are using affiliate links when they are linking to certain brands and products. Even if it's, something that isn't linkable to, like, for example, auto, right? Like, you can link to Mercedes.com, but you're not linking to a car that you can buy,
Yeah.
right? And we can make assumptions that if, XYZ influencer sold $5,000 Chanel bags last month, then their audience is probably a good audience for a campaign with Mercedes. We can make certain assumptions that way. But again, for someone like Mercedes, and most auto brands, they're really looking for impressions. So they're looking at a top of funnel sort of marketing strategy. They're not looking for conversion. I mean, yes, of course, they want to sell more cars, but because there's no way to actually track, did this influencer campaign or strategy sell more cars at the dealership level, right? They really care about perception and eyeballs and, sort of awareness.
Yeah.
Where you get really granular is things like that you can track, whether it's direct to consumer brands or, brands available through certain retailers, and then you can get that purchase data, and then you can obviously make assumptions from there.
Does this mean you like working more with direct-to-consumer brands since it's more trackable, or is it Mercedes' big like wallet that's like, hey, like just give me the impressions, and so you like working with the top of funnel brands because there's less liability on the influencer side, there's less accountability, is what I mean.
There's definitely less liability and accountability for sure. I mean, to tell you honestly, I like them both. I like the luxury brands, despite obviously that it's much easier to work on a campaign that's impression based, right? And those brands will come to us and they're buying influencers like media. Well, they'll say, well, I need a $5 CPM, right?
That
And even though
whoa.
that's not how it works, we can get there. We can work on a strategy that gives them influencers and, enough media, so that we're reaching a $5 CPM. But what's interesting about luxury brands that's very different than the direct to consumer brands in our experience is the luxury brands, or the more top of funnel brands, are really looking for influencers to tell a story, which means that they give more creative control to the influencers, which is the kind of stuff we like to work on, because we like choosing and picking people who are going to be able to relate that sort of story to their audience, versus, if we're working with a direct to consumer beauty brand, which is, a lot of them in the space right now, it's okay. It's great that we can track the information, we can make certain assumptions, and we can hit goals, and we can get to certain, conversion numbers. But at the end of the day, all they really want is for an influencer to be like, this is the best shampoo ever, like ever that you're going to use. It's going to be the best shampoo ever.
Yeah,
Right.
you have to be
So
authentic when you have to do that.
yeah, and it's like authentic enough, because most influencers today care so much about their relationship with their audience, because that's the value, right? If they lose
Yeah.
that, they don't have a business. So the authenticity really comes down to influencers who are, saying, sure, I'll work with that direct to consumer shampoo brand, but I need a month of trying it first before I tell my audience that it's the best, because that brand will say, not only do you have to shoot it like this, you also have to say these things about it.
I see. Yeah,
Right.
this
So
actually.
that's the sort of difference, and what makes each one kind of,
Yeah.
there's positives and negatives on each
And,
side.
and this is also the evolution of influencer marketing, which I think has led to what happened in our previous session. We're talking about, giving back and social impact. And I think
Yeah.
influencers now are looking for that, right?
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, what's been interesting, I think you and I talked about this in our sort of pre-session. One of the biggest changes that we've seen is on the contractual side of things. Back when I first started the agency, I mean, contracts were basically like an email negotiation and then like a PayPal, like, hey, here's $50, right?
Okay.
Now we're at a point where, I mean, our contracts are like 12 pages long, because we have so much legal liability, and we obviously take on that liability for the talent that we represent, because we subcontract the
Oh,
talent,
geez. Yeah,
at
I see
least
what
the
you're
way,
saying.
yes, Socialite works. So we care very much about the work that we're doing and a lot of the terms related to the campaign and the content and et cetera, right? And one of the changes that we've seen, especially over the last year and a half, is that morality clauses, which became part of our world maybe 2 years ago. And honestly, it became part of our world when brands started using influencers as sort of larger tier ambassadors, right? And putting them in ad campaigns and signing, a couple $100,000 year-long campaigns where they were really the voice, right? They attended events. They were really the face of this brand on sort of a more, not a macro level like a celebrity would be, but similar type of activation.
Yeah.
At the time, brands started including morality clauses so that if an influencer said something negative about the brand or did something, public that, the brand didn't like, they could terminate those ambassador programs.
Yeah.
And then last year, with everything that sort of happened, influencers started asking for mutual morality clauses
Oh my gosh.
because they were like, well, I want to be able to terminate if the brand is doing something that I don't, that doesn't fit with my core values or my morals or,
Like if the
et
CEO
cetera.
of the brand gets caught doing something nefarious.
Yeah, exactly. Or it's found out that the brand, there's like slave labor involved in creating the product, or, there's whatever it is, right? Whatever it is. So that became huge and something that over the last year and a half, we've seen a lot of contracts be terminated by influencers, which has never happened in the past, right?
Yeah,
Influencers
they're getting money, so they would almost think, not to be that. But like you said,
exactly,
they're risking the relationship with their audience, which is way
correct,
more sacred than one contract, I'd have to imagine.
And I think part of that also has to do with the fact that, again, a couple years ago, there was significantly less, the industry wasn't as saturated with content creators, going back to my comment of everyone and their mother is an influencer.
Yeah.
So an influencer who was like, okay, yeah, if I lose 100 followers, it's fine. I'll gain them back by posting, in a acai bowl, right? Now you don't have that. If you lose that follower, like it means a lot and it's really difficult to gain that follower back. So, they care more about that follower than $1,000, campaign or even a $20,000 campaign. We've had influencers, something came out publicly and an influencer, on our roster would be like, hey, I know it's $100,000, but I don't want to work with that brand. Like, so there's no amount of money now that you can pay an influencer to not be authentic to who they are and what they believe. And that's also been a huge change because 5 years ago, they were like, money. Yes, I don't care. I'll say whatever you want me to say, So that's also, yeah.
This reminds me a lot of the evolution of e-commerce itself, where in the beginning, people would just launch a store, white label a product, and it was all about acquisition. And we're now clearly into the balance of retention and how we care about retaining customers. Simultaneously, influencers care more about retaining their followers. Almost at the same time, it feels like the same level of progression over the last few years, where people switch focus from acquisition to retention.
Exactly, and part of that has to do with most influencers, and I can speak to mostly about the ones that we represent, right? And the ones that are represented other agencies who I'm friends with. Their biggest sort of dream, or I guess what they're all working towards, is being able to launch their own brands, whether it's their own, e-com shop or maybe a store or whatever. They recognize that there's an end to this at some point, right? They're either going to age out or they're going to become less relevant because they just don't create the type of content, and et cetera. Like I had a phone call with an influencer this morning that was like, I'm just not going to do TikTok. I'm just not going to do it, and at some point, like, okay, you're not going to do it. But if that's where the audience is, and that's how you're going to diversify your brand, it's your choice. But 3 years from now, TikTok could be the only platform, right? Like there's a possibility there's a risk there. So if you're not getting in early and it's already late, like if you're not on TikTok today, you're already late to the game, right? As an influencer. So my point is like, you either have to move with the times or there's no longevity for you. And if you don't have an audience that cares about you enough, is engaged with you and the life that you're living enough to eventually launch your own brand, there's really no other avenue.
I see. This reminds me a lot of poker, by the way. So I played high stakes poker for 10 years, and there's no limit hold'em is a common game, but you have to evolve. Now a lot of people play a different game and they play multiple games, but some people just stuck with one. I know it sounds silly, but they're just like channels. So like in my mind, they're the exact same thing.
That's a really interesting comparison. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, like totally off the wall for you and probably most of the people listening, but for me, it is totally synonymous. When you because I was that you make your money from the channel and you have to go where the money is. So evolving to new channels, but we could talk for another 30 minutes. I have so many more questions. I want to make sure I get one in here at the end before we have to move into the
Please.
next session, which is when should merchants, especially the D2C brands listening here, when should they be looking to work with you, with Socialite, and with your partner company that helps merchants secure influencers and launch big programs like that?
Honestly, at any point, I mean, we do a lot of launches. So brands will come to us even in the phases of like, we just developed our product, we don't even have a website yet, and we help sort of advise on the customer journey on their website. Because funny enough, that's also really important. You can have a ton of influencers post about your brand and drive traffic to your website. And if you don't have a good experience for the customer once they land on your website, it doesn't matter how many influencers say that you're the best shampoo ever. So
Yeah.
that's a big portion of what we do is, there's a point where we can only do so much unless we're really focusing on, some of these other things.
I love that you're taking it all the way to the end of the funnel, because yeah, that's a good way to waste money in an influencer program, is to have a poor on-site experience.
Yeah, I mean,
it's
some
totally
brands
outside
don't
your control.
recognize that, right? Where they're like, we're spending all this money in influencers, and we're like, okay, well, we generated, I don't know, 10,000, people that clicked on your website, but then, all of them abandoned their cart. Why? Right? Like, and
Yeah.
trying to understand why that's happening is really important, because again, influencers, while they, do what they do best, which is drive, traffic, right, and consideration at the end of the day, you can lose that customer if you don't have a good experience for them once they land wherever it is you're trying to send them. So that's kind of important. But again, I think top line answer at any point.
Awesome. And I'm plugging Lighthouse as well, so I'm getting that in
Thank
here.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Lighthouse
Awesome.
is sort of the brand strategy side of our agency. It's fully talent agnostic, and it's fully focused on brand strategy and casting, and helping brands really, have a sort of voice in the space.
Awesome. I love it. You're clearly an expert in this field. It was great to go through the past,
Thank
present, and
you.
into the future of influencer marketing with you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you.